Movses Khorenatsi was a prominent Armenian historian from the period of Late Antiquity and the author of the History of Armenia. Khorenatsi is credited with the earliest known historiographical work on the history of Armenia written in Armenian, but was also a poet, or hymn writer, and a grammarian. The History of Armenia was written at the behest of Prince Sahak of the Bagratuni dynasty and has had an enormous impact on Armenian historiography. It was used and quoted extensively by later medieval Armenian authors, although other Armenians such as Agathangelos had previously written histories on Armenia. Movses' work holds particular significance because it contains unique material on the old oral traditions in Armenia before its conversion to Christianity and, more importantly, traces Armenian history from Movses' day back to its origins. Khorenatsi is considered to be the father of Armenian history, and is sometimes referred to as the Armenian Herodotus. Khorenatsi's work became the first attempt of a universal history of Armenia. Movses identified himself as a young disciple of Mesrop-Mashtots, inventor of the Armenian alphabet, and is recognized by the Armenian Apostolic Church as one of the holy translators. Biography, early life and education. Movses' biographical details are given at the very end of the History of the Armenians, but additional information provided by later medieval Armenian historians have allowed modern scholars to piece together additional information on him. Movses was believed to have been born in the village of Korni in the Armenian province of Taranatulubaran sometime in 410. However, some scholars contend that if he was born here, he would have then been known as Movses of Khorenatsi. They instead moved the location of his birth from Taran to the Armenian province of Syanik, in the village of Khorena in the region of Harband. He received his education in Syanik, and was later sent to be taught under the auspices of Mesrop-Mashtots, the creator of the Armenian alphabet, and Catholicos Sahak Partef. In having considerable difficulty translating the Bible from Greek to Armenian, Mesrop and Sahak felt the need to send Movses and several of their other students to Alexandria, Egypt, at the time the center of education and learning, so that they themselves learn the Greek and Syriac languages, as well as grammar, oratory, theology and philosophy. Return to Armenia. The students left Armenia sometime between 432 and 435. First they went to Edessa, where they studied at the local libraries. Then they moved towards Jerusalem and Alexandria. After studying in Alexandria for 5 to 6 years, Movses and his classmates returned to Armenia, only to find that Mesrop and Sahak had died. Movses expressed his grief in a lament at the end of History of the Armenians. While they awaited our return to celebrate the students' accomplishments, we hastened from Byzantium, expecting that we would be dancing and singing at a wedding, and instead I found myself grieving at the foot of our teachers' graves. I did not even arrive in time to see their eyes closed nor hear them speak the final words. To further complicate the problems, the atmosphere in Armenia that Movses and the other students had returned to was one that was extremely hostile, and they were viewed with contempt by the native population. While later Armenian historians blamed this on an ignorant populace, Persian ideology and policy also lay at fault, since its rulers could not tolerate highly educated young scholars fresh from Greek centers of learning. Given this atmosphere and persecution by the Persians, Movses went into hiding in a village near Vahashipat and lived in relative seclusion for several decades. Gyut, Catholicos of all Armenians, one day met Movses while traveling through the area and, unaware of his true identity, invited him to supper with several of his students. Movses was initially silent, but after Gayuth's students encouraged him to speak, Movses made a marvelous speech at the dinner table. One of the Catholicos students was able to identify Movses as a person Gyut had been searching for. It was soon understood that Gyut was one of Movses' former classmates and friends. Gyut embraced Movses and, being either a Chalcedonian Christian or at least tolerant of them, brought his friend back from seclusion and appointed him to be a bishop in Bagratuni. History of the Armenians. Serving as a bishop, Movses was approached by Prince Sahak Bagratuni, who, having heard of Movses' reputation, asked him to write a history of the Armenians, especially the biographies of Armenian kings and the origins of the Armenian Nakara families. Movses agreed to do so, and he finished his book sometime in 482. However, Artashes Matavosyan, an expert on medieval Armenian manuscripts, basing his conclusions on new details revealed in his research on the chronicle by the 6th century Armenian historian Artanas Khorenatsi, placed Movses' completion of history to the year 474. One of his primary reasons for taking up Sahak Bagratuni's request is given in the first part of Patmata and Hayos, or History of the Armenians. For even though we are small and very limited in numbers and have been conquered many times by foreign kingdoms, yet too many acts of bravery have been performed in our land, worthy of being written and remembered, but of which no one has bothered to write down. His work is a first historical record that covered the whole history of Armenia from a very ancient period until the death of the historian. His history served as a textbook to study the history of Armenia until the 18th century. Movses' history also gives a rich description of the oral traditions that were popular among the Armenians of the time, such as the romance story of Artashes and Satnik and the birth of the god Vatin. Movses lived for several more years, and he died sometime in the late 490s. Literary influence. Three possible early references to Movses in other sources are usually identified. The first one is in Gizapapitsai's History of the Armenians, where the author details the persecution of several notable Armenian individuals, including the blessed Movses the philosopher, identified by some scholars as Movses Khorenatsi, but there is no indication in Papitsi that this Movses had composed any historical works. The second one is the Book of Letters, which contains a short theological treatise by Movses Khorenatsi. Quote, however, this treatise, not being an historical work, cannot be convincingly attributed to the historian Movses. The third possible early reference is in our 10th-11th centuries manuscript containing a list of dates attributed to Athanasius of Turin. Under the year 474, the list has Moses of Khoren, philosopher and writer. This mention is, however, considered as too uncertain. A historian by the name of Moses was unknown to Armenian literature before the 10th century. The references to Moses and the use of information from his book can be found in the works by Movses Khorenatsi, Kathvatsi, Tophma Artruni, Hovhandraskarnakatsi, and later medieval Armenian authors. According to Tophma Artruni, Khorenatsi's history had a fourth section which was finished between 470 to 490. However, there has been no verification of Artruni's claim. Authorship study. Hypercritical phase, beginning in the 19th century, as a part of a general trend in those years to re-examine critically the validity of classical sources. Movses' history was cast into doubt after the discovery of historical inconsistencies and anachronisms. The conclusions reached by Alfred von Gutschmidt ushered in the hypercritical phase of the study of Movses' work. Many European and Armenian scholars write writing at the turn of the 20th century reduced its importance as a historical source and dated the history to sometime in the 7th to 9th centuries. Stepan Malkasians, an Armenian philologist and expert of classical Armenian literature, likened this early critical period from the late 19th to early 20th centuries to a competition, whereby one scholar attempted to outperform the other in their criticism of Movses' modern studies. In the early decades of the 20th century, scholars such as Frederick Cornwallis Konabir and Stepan Malkasians rejected the conclusions of the scholars of the hypercritical school. Ethnographic and archaeological research during this time confirmed information which was found only in Movses' work and supported the view to move back the dating to the 5th century. Despite these studies, these critical points were revived in the second half of the 20th century, and many Western scholars continue to maintain the arguments raised by earlier scholars. Robert W. Thomson, the former holder of the chair in Armenian Studies at Harvard University and the translator of several classical Armenian works, claimed that Movses' account contained various anachronisms. His approach in evaluating Movses' work was criticized when the English translation of History of the Armenians appeared in 1978. Several of the points he raised above have since been challenged. Vrej and the curator of the Christian Middle East section at the British Library, took issue with many of Thomson's points, including his later dating of the writing and his contention that Movses was merely writing an apologist work for the Bagratunis. If so, how does one explain then Moses' complete preoccupation with the events preceding A.D. 440 and his silence regarding the events leading up the Arab incursions and occupation of Armenia between 640 to 642? Moreover, if the definite purpose of the history was for boosting the reputation of the Bagratuni family, then these events should have been central theme of his history, the skillful handling of which brought the Bagratid preeminence. The ecclesiastical interests do not point to the 8th century. There is no echo of the Chalcedonian controversy which engaged the Armenians from 451 to 641, when the ecclesiastical unity formulated by the Council of Theodosiopolis was renounced. Gagik Sargsyan, an Armenian scholar of the classics and a leading biographer of Moses, also admonished Thomson for anachronistic hypercriticism and for stubbornly rehashing and even exaggerating the statements once put forward by the late 19th and early 20th century scholars, and in particular by Grigor Kalatians. Sargsyan noted that Thomson, in condemning Movses' failure to mention his sources, ignored the fact that an antique medieval author may have had his own rules of mentioning the sources distinct from the rules of modern scientific ethics. Thomson's allegation of Movses' plagiarism and supposed distortion of sources was also countered by scholars who contended that Thomson was treating a medieval author with the standards of 20th century historiography, and pointed out that numerous classical historians, Greek and Roman alike, engaged in the same practice. Aram Topkian, a research fellow at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem of Armenian Studies, concurred with this observation, and noted that it was odd that Thomson would fault Moses for failing to mention his sources, because this was an accepted practice among all classical historians. Khorenatsi's work is recognized as an important source for the research of Eurasian and early Armenian history. The following works are also attributed to Movses: Letter on the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, Homily on Christ's Transfiguration, History of Rip Sime and her Companions, Hymns used in Armenian church worship, Commentaries on the Armenian Grammarians, Explanations of Armenian church offices.